When you think of George Washington, you probably picture the face on the dollar bill, right? Or that giant monument in D.C. He's the father of his country, the indispensable man. But the real story of how he earned that title, well, it's way more complex and honestly, a lot more interesting than the myths we're told. Because here's the thing, and this is the real puzzle of Washington. The guy lost more battles than he won. I mean, he led his army through some truly crushing defeats, some really humiliating retreats. So, how does that guy become the one person everyone agrees is the only one who can lead a brand new country? That's what we're going to dig into. Okay, so to really get Washington the leader, you got to go back, way back. Before he was president, before he was even a revolutionary. We need to look at him as a young guy, super ambitious, but also, constantly frustrated. He's this colonial officer who's just dying to make a name for himself. But the world he's in, well, it just doesn't see him as an equal. His first real taste of military life came during the French and Indian War. And wow, what a trial by fire. In 1754, as a young officer, he makes this fateful call to ambush a French group and basically helps kick off a global war. Not a great start. It ends with him having to surrender Fort Necessity. A year later, he's in the middle of the disastrous Braddock expedition. I mean, he had 2 horses shot right out from under him. He barely made it out alive. So by 1758, you can imagine he'd had enough. He quits his commission, totally fed up with the whole British military setup. And here's what really got to him. This was the ultimate slap in the face. After everything he'd done, all his ambition, the British Army just wouldn't give him a permanent official royal commission. Why? Because to them, he was always just a colonial, second class. And that rejection, man, it stung. It really planted these seeds of resentment that down the line would totally catch fire and turn into revolution. So, all that simmering resentment, it finally found its purpose in the American Revolution. Suddenly, he's the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. And let's be real, the job was basically impossible. He's supposed to take on the most powerful military on the planet with, what, a scrappy, underfunded, frankly ragtag group of soldiers? And right out of the gate, it was a total disaster. In 1776, the British show up in New York with this huge army. Washington tries to fight them on Long Island and gets completely outplayed. I mean, his army was almost wiped out. He had to pull off this desperate, humiliating retreat all the way across New Jersey. Honestly, the whole revolution could have just fizzled out right then and there. And the hardship, it's just hard to even imagine. We've all heard of the winter at Valley Forge, right? Well, picture this. While the British are living it up in the capital, Philadelphia, Washington's army is literally freezing to death. We're talking 2,000 to 3,000 soldiers dead. Not from battle, but from disease, from starvation, from the sheer cold. This was the absolute bottom. But this is where we see Washington's true genius. It wasn't always about being the smartest guy on the battlefield. His real superpower, it was his incredible, unshakable persistence. He just would not give up. He held that army together with pure willpower, inspiring these guys when all hope seemed totally lost. And that persistence, it finally paid off. We jump forward to 1781, at Yorktown. Thanks to some massive help from the French, Washington manages to trap the main British army and force them to surrender. That was it. That was the knockout punch. See, he didn't win every fight, but by just refusing to quit, by outlasting the enemy, he won the war. So, the war is won. You'd think you could finally relax, right? Not even close. Washington's work was just getting started. Now came the next challenge, and it was maybe even harder than beating the British, actually building a country that would last. And just think about this for a second. George Washington is the only president in U.S. history who was unanimously elected, not once, but twice. That's not just a political win. That's a statement. It shows you the absolute universal trust that everyone had in him. They all knew he was the only one who could possibly hold this fragile new nation together. And one of his first moves as president was just brilliant. He creates the cabinet, but look who he puts in it. He brings in the 2 biggest rivals in the whole country, Thomas Jefferson, the idealist, and Alexander Hamilton, the financial guy. These 2 argued about everything, about the very soul of America. And their epic fights basically created our first political parties. And where was Washington? Right in the middle of it all, trying to steer the ship through the storm.
The thing is, Washington knew exactly what he was doing. He was so aware that he was living in this massive historical moment. He understood that every single thing he did, every decision, every ceremony, was going to set a precedent for every president who came after him. In his own words, he wanted to fix these precedents on true principles. He was literally inventing the presidency from scratch.
And look at the precedents he set. They're still with us today. The whole idea of a cabinet, that was him. Calling the leader Mr. President instead of some fancy royal title, him again. Giving an inaugural address, yep. And maybe the biggest one of all, walking away after 2 terms, voluntarily giving up power. In a world full of kings who ruled for life, that was absolutely revolutionary.
But we can't stop there. To really understand the man, we have to look past the general and the president. We have to confront the deepest and honestly the most troubling contradiction of his entire life.
Because this is Washington, in 2 parts. On one hand, you have the champion of liberty, the man who led a revolution based on the idea that all men are created equal. And on the other hand, a Virginia plantation owner who, over his lifetime, owned hundreds of human beings. That is the central, unavoidable paradox of George Washington. And this wasn't just some abstract idea. Look at this. It's a real newspaper ad from 1796. While he was president, Washington used his power to try and recapture a woman named Ona Judge. She was one of his wife's enslaved servants who had escaped to freedom. It's just such a stark reminder that this fight for American liberty was happening at the exact same time as the brutal, active practice of slavery. Now, his thinking on slavery did change over time. It wasn't a straight line. It was slow, it was complicated, and frankly, it was never enough. He started out as a typical planter. Enslaved people or property. But the revolutionary ideals he was fighting for, they started to get to him. He began to express doubts, but only in private. He'd tell his friends he wanted to see slavery end, but he never took a public stand. The only real final step he took was in his will, where he ordered that the 123 people he personally owned be freed, but only after his wife died.
So, where does that leave us?
Well, we're left with this towering figure. A man so important that the nation he helped create builds these incredible monuments to him. His role in winning the war, in setting up a government that would last, it's just monumental. There's no other word for it. And that brings us to the final, really tough question, the one we all have to wrestle with. On one hand, Washington's leadership literally held the country together when it could have just fallen apart. He built the foundation of the republic. But on the other hand, he was part of the brutal, horrifying system of slavery. So the challenge for us isn't if we should remember him. Of course we have to. The real challenge is how. How do you hold both of those truths at the same time? How do we remember the indispensable founder and the deeply flawed man? That's the complicated legacy he left behind for all of us to figure out.